Zane has been training, coaching, and posting from San Diego for decades, and at 83 years old, he is beginning to speak more openly about the full arc of his career. That includes his complicated relationship with the IFBB, a contest that left a lasting mark on him, and his views on how the sport evolved after his era. What he's saying invites a closer look at the history. This is not nostalgia. Zane holds 2 degrees, including a master's in experimental psychology, and built a reputation over decades, not just through his background in chemistry, but through a methodical, analytical approach to training and competition. The IFBB shaped the conditions of his career. He in turn shaped what the sport came to recognize as its aesthetic standard. The relationship between the two was never entirely straightforward. To understand Zane's later statements about the federation, it helps to start at the beginning. Zane approached his physique the way a researcher approaches a controlled experiment. He identified variables, isolated them, tracked results, and adjusted based on what the data showed. In an era when most bodybuilders trained by instinct or by following whoever was biggest in the gym, Zane was running structured protocols. He competed at under 200 pounds, consistently placed above athletes who outweighed him by 20, 30, or 40 pounds. His waist at peak conditioning was reportedly around 29 inches. His shoulder-to-waist ratio, what the sport calls a V-taper, remains a reference point in aesthetic discussions today. In 2015, Muscle and Fitness named him the best physique of all time. That designation reflected specific criteria, not sentiment. The effectiveness of his approach extended well beyond the weights he lifted. He incorporated visualization, meditation, and deliberate year-round tanning so he would never appear washed out under stage lighting. He took tens of thousands of color slides of himself to track his visual progress at a time when most competitors focused on the scale. His view was direct. You're not judged on your body weight, you're judged on what you look like. In 1977, that was not a widely held position. On the subject of performance-enhancing substances, Zane has been straightforward. He has discussed the oral and injectable compounds common in his era: dianabol, anavar, primobolan, decodurabolin, and testosterone. He has spoken about the use of thyroid medication ahead of competitions to accelerate fat metabolism. Injectable amino acids, purified collagen protein administered directly into the bloodstream to bypass digestion, were another tool he and others in the Venice Beach training community used before the practice became widely known in the sport. None of these substances were illegal at the time, and none were concealed from the sport's leadership. What distinguishes Zane from many of his contemporaries is his willingness to describe these practices without euphemism. He states what the substances were, where his personal limits were, and where he believes those limits stand today. Joe Weider didn't create bodybuilding, but he built the machine that turned it into a business. And for decades, that machine defined the sport. He was the publisher, the promoter, and the man who determined which athletes received exposure and which ones remained confined to regional circuits. His relationship with Arnold Schwarzenegger is the most documented example of how that system operated. Weider identified Arnold in Europe, brought him to America, managed his image, and promoted his contests. In exchange, the most recognizable face in the sport's history became the public representation of his brand, a partnership that proved profitable well beyond either man's initial expectations. Zane's relationship with Weider was different, less celebrated and more complicated. Weider did compensate Zane for articles, photo shoots, and endorsements, and he did provide meaningful exposure. But Weider was known among insiders as a size guy, someone who believed mass was the commercial engine of bodybuilding, and who communicated that preference to athletes consistently. Zane had built his entire identity around aesthetics, symmetry, and proportion rather than sheer bulk, and that put him in direct philosophical conflict with Weider's priorities from the start. He resisted the push toward heavier training and greater size for years, and the results reflected that tension: repeated top 5 finishes at the Olympia, but never the title. In 1977, that changed. Weider convinced Zane to alter his training approach: more weight, lower volume, heavier compound movements. Zane added size he had never previously carried. He won the Mr. Olympia that year, becoming the first man under 200 pounds to claim the overall title. He repeated in 1978 and again in 1979, a year he has consistently described as his best, the most complete version of himself he ever presented on a competitive stage. By any measure, those 3 years represented the peak of aesthetic bodybuilding. No competitor has since replicated what Zane achieved in terms of proportion and presentation under competition conditions. Winning, however, came with costs, physical ones that would surface in his joints later, and professional ones that appeared sooner. The relationship between Zane and the IFBB's most influential patron remained transactional at its foundation. Weider wanted mass to drive the sport's commercial identity. Zane won by making artistry the defining standard. That tension between the two approaches never fully resolved, and by 1980 it was heading toward a breaking point. The 1980 Mr. Olympia was held at the Sydney Opera House in Sydney, Australia. It became the most debated, disputed, and consequential contest in the sport's history, and Frank Zane was at the center of the controversy before the competition began. 8 weeks before the event, Zane suffered what has been described as a near-fatal accident involving a fall near his pool. He lost 15 pounds of muscle mass and was hospitalized for an extended period. As the reigning three-time champion, he was suddenly in no condition to mount a credible defense. The question of whether to travel to Australia at all consumed him, and he turned to a trusted friend for guidance, a fellow competitor he had no reason to doubt. He called Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold watched him pose and told him to go to Australia and defend his title. What Zane did not know, and what almost no one knew at the time, was that Arnold was quietly planning to enter the contest himself. Arnold had been contracted as a commentator for CBS, which was scheduled to broadcast the event for the first time. He arrived in Sydney, and one day before the competition, he announced he was competing. The reaction was swift and widespread. Promoters were furious, athletes were blindsided. The reigning champion, whom Arnold had personally encouraged to compete while still injured and undertrained, now had to share the stage with the man who had privately worked against him. By any reasonable interpretation, it was a serious breach of trust, and the contest had not yet begun. What unfolded on stage compounded the controversy. Arnold's conditioning was widely acknowledged to be well below his competitive peak. Bodybuilding journalists and insiders present at the event were direct in their assessments. He was performing at roughly 70% of his prime form. Mike Mensa, who had arrived in peak condition and was regarded by many as the strongest competitor in the field, did not place in the final two. Chris Dickerson, leaner, more muscular, with a stronger overall package, made the final two and was awarded the runner-up position. Arnold Schwarzenegger, with 8 weeks of serious training and documented weaknesses in multiple body parts, was declared Mr. Olympia for the 7th time. The crowd booed. Ben Weider, the IFBB president, was reportedly furious and stated publicly that Dickerson had been robbed. Iron Man magazine was forced to edit reader letters due to the language used to describe the decision. CBS brought their footage back to the United States and declined to air the broadcast, with executives indicating the contest had been fixed. They reportedly showed Chris Dickerson the footage as evidence of the judging failure. The network's relationship with Mr. Olympia ended entirely, marking the last time an American broadcast television network filmed the event. In the aftermath, Zane was deeply affected. He had finished third behind Arnold and Dickerson, competing at his worst in years because a friend had encouraged him to appear, a friend who turned out to be the man who cost him a 4th title. Boyko publicly stated that Arnold's legs looked like they belonged in a chicken coop. Roger Walker called Arnold an embarrassment on that stage. Mike Mensa, who had invested everything in his preparation and left with nothing, retired from bodybuilding immediately. He maintained for the rest of his life that the 1980 Olympia had been rigged. He never competed again. Frank Zane, Boyko, Roger Walker, and Mike Mensa all boycotted the 1981 Mr. Olympia. It was a direct protest, a formal rejection of a system they no longer considered trustworthy. The IFBB responded by revising the rules governing judging panels and the authority to select judges. It was an institutional acknowledgement that something had gone seriously wrong. But rule changes did not undo the damage, nor did they alter the broader pattern of politics and favoritism that had produced the scandal. That pattern continued. Zane, watching from outside the competition, came to a clearer understanding of how the IFBB operated, one the organization had no interest in making public. Zane did return to competition. He finished second at the 1982 Olympia behind Chris Dickerson, who received the title that many believed had been taken from him 2 years earlier. In 1983, Zane competed again following a bicycle accident that required shoulder surgery, pushed through the injury, finished 4th at the Olympia, and then retired from competition permanently. The decision was not only physical. The sport had shown him over years what it was. In the decades since, his public statements have been measured and at times pointed when he has moved beyond diplomacy. He has not made a habit of lengthy public criticism of the IFBB's internal workings, but across interviews, newsletter writings, and documented comments within the bodybuilding community, the picture he has consistently drawn is not a favorable one. His most direct critique concerns judging. He has stated plainly that culture in professional bodybuilding is not primarily the athlete's fault, it is the judges. His framing has been consistent. I don't blame the bodybuilders. Basically, they are just doing what it takes to win. I blame the judges. The judges are the ones that say you are the best. That statement shifts the moral weight of the sport crisis away from the competitors and onto the institution itself. It positions the IFBB as having created the incentive structure that made extreme pharmaceutical use the rational choice for any athlete trying to win. That critique connects to a pattern that investigative reporters have since documented. A 2022 Washington Post investigation into competitive bodybuilding found what insiders had long described, that the NPC and IFBB Pro League The governing bodies of American professional bodybuilding had operated for decades as a patronage system. Judges and promoters who remained loyal to leadership were rewarded. Athletes who crossed those in power found themselves frozen out or consistently downgraded in competition results. One former judge described witnessing result manipulation during a 2010 contest, phone calls placed to the judging panel mid-deliberation, outcomes altered after the fact. According to the reporting, this was not an isolated incident. It reflected how the organization functioned. This is the institution Zane competed in. The same institution that awarded a Mr. Olympia title to a competitor who entered the contest a day before it began, whose conditioning was widely regarded as subpar, while the reigning champion placed third and the pre-contest favorite withdrew on the spot. The IFBB's response to the 1980 controversy was procedural, adjustments to the judging process. The structural authority that allowed it to happen remained intact. In the years that followed, as the institution continued operating as it had, the athletes were dying. The deaths in professional bodybuilding over the past several years have been significant in both number and profile. Shawn Rhoden, who won the Mr. Olympia in 2018, died in 2021. George Peterson died in 2021 at 37 years old. On the morning of the Mr. Olympia he was registered to compete in, Boston Lloyd, who was public about his pharmaceutical protocols, died in March 2022 at 29. Cedric McMillan died in April 2022 at 44. These were active, high-level competitors with substantial followings, and they died within a span of less than 12 months. The governing bodies of the sport offered little public response. Zane has addressed this directly. When asked about the deaths and their causes, he has not offered a diplomatic answer. He has been clear that today's athletes are operating at levels of pharmaceutical use that differ from his era not just in degree but in kind. The compounds available, the dosing protocols, and the methods for pushing the body beyond its natural limits have all advanced considerably. He has described today's athletes as being on the upper end of the spectrum and has said the extremes make mandatory health monitoring a logical requirement. His perspective carries weight in part because he is not speaking from a position of complete abstinence. He has discussed openly the compounds he used during his competitive years. He understands the pharmaceutical dimension of the sport from direct experience. His position is that a line was crossed somewhere around the Dorian Yates and Ronnie Coleman era, and that the sport has not turned back from it since. Frank Zane is not on testosterone replacement therapy. In an era where nearly every former professional bodybuilder over 60 uses some form of TRT, Zane takes the opposite approach. He takes medication specifically designed to keep his testosterone levels low, based on his belief that testosterone promotes cancer growth. He stated this directly to Lisa Olastway. "I take medication to keep my testosterone low because cancer feeds on testosterone, so if you're taking testosterone, you're feeding cancer." That position comes from a man who competed for decades in a sport built on anabolic chemistry, won 3 of its highest titles, and then made a complete reversal in his personal health philosophy based on what he witnessed and what he feared. He has also been willing to criticize the supplement industry, the commercial side of a machine that sold aspiration to millions while delivering little in return. In 1985, Joe Weider's company was the subject of an FTC complaint for marketing a supplement as a steroid replacement when regulators determined the product had no meaningful effect on muscle building. That pattern did not end there. For 4 decades, the industry has relied on the same template: exotic branding, pseudo-scientific language, and elite athletes endorsing products that had no connection to their physiques. Zane has said this plainly. Supplements offer some benefit, but they are not responsible for what people see on stage. What produces those results is hard work, and at the professional level, the massive drug abuse that goes on. He has also made statements that drew significant controversy. In a 2022 interview, Zane expressed disapproval of extreme muscularity in female competitors and connected it to steroid use. Those remarks provoked direct pushback from a community that has spent years working to establish the legitimacy of women's bodybuilding. Critics noted the obvious inconsistency that male bodybuilding, including during Zane's era, was built on pharmaceutical assistance and that applying a stricter standard to women had no principled basis. Whether his views on this have changed is not publicly documented. The episode was a reminder that even the sport's most reflective figures carry some of the assumptions of their generation. All of that leads to the broader question surrounding the institution itself, what the IFBB ultimately became, whether it drew any lessons from what happened to the athletes who built it, and where Zane stands at 83. The IFBB did eventually respond, whether out of genuine reconsideration or commercial logic, to the aesthetic argument Zane had been making for decades. The classic physique division was introduced and has since become one of the most popular categories in professional bodybuilding. 3-time classic physique champion Chris Bumstead became the sport's most followed figure with over 12 million social media followers, not because of any resemblance to the mass-dominant competitors of the open division, but because of his resemblance to the golden era physiques that Zane and his contemporaries developed. The IFBB, in creating that division, made a tacit acknowledgement that the sport had moved too far in one direction. But a new division does not undo the institutional record. It does not restore the athletes who died pursuing the extreme standard that judging panels rewarded for decades. It does not erase the 1980 Olympia. It does not address the patronage system documented by investigative journalists. It does not return to Mike Mensa the title some believe was taken from him. Mensa, who struggled significantly in the years after his forced retirement, died in 2001 at the age of 49. And it does not give Frank Zane a fourth Olympia title, or the opportunity that a poolside accident and a training partner's advice foreclosed. What it does confirm is the position Zane had been articulating since before most of bodybuilding's current audience was born, that proportion and aesthetics are not simply one preference among many, but represent what the sport looks like at its best. The evidence now supports that view. Classic physique viewership, social media engagement, and consistent fan surveys all reflect a preference for the kind of physique Zane was building in the 1970s, over the extreme mass that defined the decades that followed. He has never expressed bitterness publicly, which, given the full arc of his career, is notable. He competed for over 20 years. He and his wife Christine built Zane Haven in Palm Springs, which became the foundation for the Zane Experience program, a one-on-one coaching operation that continues to run today. He wrote books, he developed training equipment, including the leg blaster for which he holds a patent. He began work on a documentary in 2020 that was still in production as of the last available reports. He operates a gallery in Laguna Beach dedicated to golden-era bodybuilding art and photography. By any measure, he is someone who found a way to build something lasting after competition ended. Making peace with a career, however, is not the same as making peace with an institution. What Zane has said about the IFBB, his attribution of the drug crisis to judges, his implicit criticism of the system behind the 1980 controversy, his warnings about where the sport's fixation on mass was taking its athletes, does not reflect quiet acceptance of the machinery that shaped and sometimes damaged his career. It reflects the conclusions of someone who has had decades to examine what happened, and who has not arrived at particularly forgiving ones. He has told aspiring bodybuilders to have a backup plan, to avoid treating bodybuilding as a complete lifestyle, because very few people can sustain it and succeed, to stop focusing on body weight and start evaluating how they actually look, to stay away from what he describes as excessive amounts of steroids and other drugs, not out of any pretense that drug use is absent from the sport, but because he has seen the outcomes firsthand. He has watched those outcomes end in funerals for men in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. He has watched a federation respond to those deaths with procedural statements and divisional rebranding, while continuing to recognize champions built on pharmaceutical regimens no human body was designed to maintain long-term. At 83, still training, still posting, still carrying a physique that most men decades younger would consider an achievement. Frank Zane stands as evidence of something the IFBB never fully acknowledged, that the approach he developed, the one they discouraged, the one undermined by organizational politics, favoritism, and an institutional preference for size was, in the end, the more durable one.